Well, this morning, so we find ourselves now the week after Easter, and something I've been thinking about a lot as I've been preparing for this morning and the conversations to have with you all. Just thinking about the question of what comes after resurrection. And as I've thought about it, I realized that resurrection really mirrors a lot of narratives and stories that we find in Scripture. And we talk a lot about New Abbey of being able to take the Bible seriously and not literally, right? And resurrection at its core is a story of what? It's a story of life after death. It's a story of finding something on the other side of something you didn't think that you were going to make it through. And that mirrors a lot of what we see in Scripture. It's finding the promised land and freedom after Egypt. It's life after, like, that Goliath will fall. It's the woman getting up after she thought she was going to be stoned, right? It's all of these things. And I realize that Scripture is constantly pointing us to this reality that there will be freedom after fear and life after these things and joy after pain. And then the question is, what do we do in those moments? I think we all know how important the wisdom and presence of Jesus is in those times where we find ourselves at the lowest of the low. You know, when things get so bad that you're like, am I charismatic? All of a sudden you're like, am I speaking in tongues? And we know what it feels like to be in Egypt or to be that person who feels like people are to stand in front of a Goliath. We know that feeling, and we know how important the words and the life of Jesus are in those times. But as I read Scripture and continue to unpack these stories, I realize that the life and presence of Jesus is also just as important when we find ourselves on the other side of those things. That there is so much wisdom for us that exists on the other side of that thing that we didn't think we would ever see the other side of. I had a handful of conversations recently that sort of pointed and reminded me of this idea. I had a conversation with someone, and we were having a conversation about politics. Are you jealous? Like, is something going on politically? I don't. And what was interesting to me is what I was sort of like gathering out of this conversation as I'm talking to my friend was it felt to me sort of like, well, I can't wait till I can do to that group what that group did to me. And it felt like Egypt, right? I was like, oh my gosh, like we have, the reason that we take these stories seriously is because we have this narrative of not wanting to leave Egypt just to become a pharaoh in another city. And then I had this other conversation with a friend about their sobriety journey and them feeling like they just reached a new like place in that journey. And they kind of said something, they were like, now I don't know what to do with like this space in my brain that was taking up every day. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. And then I had another conversation with a friend who had just gone through a breakup. And it was the kind of breakup where, do you have a friend who, don't point at them if they're here. You know the friend that breaks up with someone and no one's sad? Everyone's like, whew. Okay. Thank you. And all of these reminded me of the truth that we find in Scripture. That when we find ourselves on the other side of something that we couldn't, when we find the freedom and when we find the healing and when we recognize the pattern, we have to put something in place and we have to do something differently and we have to care for that thing. And we should be different. Corey talked about this last week. After the resurrection of Jesus, nothing was different. The same people were still in power, all the same things were happening. He was different. And sometimes when we experience transformation in our lives, everything stays the same. All the people, the walking red flags that we can or cannot enter, they're still there. We have to act differently. All of our triggers, all of our vices, all of our things, they're all still there. We get to change. And when we do that, we have to cultivate it. A couple months ago, I had a few too many martinis, which, by the way, is anything more than one martini. Martinis are so strong. And my first time having martinis, no one told me that it's just, there's nothing else in there. Just it's olive juice and alcohol. And so I had a few too many martinis, which is like 2. And my wife was like, I knew you'd had too many martinis because you made everyone sit down and you talked about the importance of Deuteronomy. I was like, yeah. That'll do it. That's when you know. I was like, you know what? I really want to bring something up. Everyone gather around. In case you're wondering how fun I am at a party. But I said then, and I'll say now, okay? I think that Deuteronomy is one of the most important books of the Bible. And let me tell you, how much time do I have? But truly, I think a lot of scholars will say that the rest of the scriptures really hinge on the Exodus story. That this is the crux of the narrative of scripture, of this oppressed group finding freedom, of Moses coming in, of Pharaoh falling, of all these things that rest on the book of Exodus. And the book of Exodus is beautiful and it's wonderful in that story. And I think so many of us have been in a season where we have felt oppressed by something, someone, some place, some relationship, some pattern, something, some habit. And we find our freedom. And what makes the story so powerful after that Exodus moment is then we get to Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is all about how do we build something different? And how do we chart a new way forward? Deuteronomy is where we get things like the 10 Commandments, which aren't just like a weird, arbitrary set of rules. I've started to see them as so beautiful. It's just a way of saying, how do we not become the very thing that we left? Now that we have found freedom, now that we have recognized, now that we're out of that thing, how do we not just become that thing? And there's so many things that we see in Scripture. Get up, go and sin no more. And the resurrection, all these things that say, how now will you be different on the other side of this freedom? And it's a reminder to me that I think I'm reclaiming and redefining and understanding a different way in my life how important it is to have spiritual practices. That if I don't protect the healing and the freedom that I've experienced, then I will do it. I'll fall right back into the pattern. I went to therapy camp last year. It's as fun as it sounds, and it's literally like a week in the mountains of like intensive therapy, and they take all your devices. You're completely off the grid. You're with a group of 40 people, and you go off and you do individual and group therapy for like 8 hours a day. And it was so beautiful, and I'll treasure it for the rest of my life. But they've got all these rules, and one of the rules is no romantic, engagements, right? And the therapist on the first day, he was like, you're going to meet someone here, and you're going to feel like, I feel like I've known this person my whole life. And he said, you have. It's called a pattern. And I said, oh, gagged, honey. Okay, fair, okay. Some people in the room are like, but that's the reality, right? We all have these patterns and these things in our life, and then we sort of have a moment of clarity, a moment of freedom, a moment where we recognize these patterns, where we recognize these things, and we have to just do things in our life. We have to act differently because of it, or we will fall right back into that pattern. We will go right back to Pharaoh. We will go right back into Goliath. We'll go right back in those people being like, why are they throwing stones again? Because you didn't get up and leave, right? I know, and so I think, who grew up in the church? Like you kind of grew up and you, actually that makes sense, we're in a church. I was like, whoa, like I'm at Kylie Minogue night. So for a lot of times, I think I had these interesting ties to my spiritual practices, right? I would get up every day and I would read, My Utmost for His Highest and Purpose-Driven Life. And those books aren't bad, but I would, in my mind, the correlation was, I need to do this for at least 10 minutes a day so that God is not mad at me and I don't honestly, end up in hell. You know what I mean? This is all something I'm trying to do to, appease something or to appear in some way. And I think for a lot of time I left some of those practices behind because I didn't understand. Once I realized God isn't mad at me and I'm good, then I sort of I let off the gas of that spiritual practice a little bit. And recently I've realized there are so many places in my life where I've experienced extreme healing and freedom, where I've recognized patterns. Okay, I just said I spent a week at therapy camp, okay? So I've unpacked some things. But if I don't put practices in my life to guard that and to hold that and to make space for that, then I will fall right back into it. And it's as simple as that. There's nothing magical. At this church, I'm never going to tell you, here's the book everyone needs to read. This is everyone's book. Here's the things. It's 10 minutes. Your spiritual practice needs to look exactly like this. We just won't ever do that. What I will say is, I think when we look at our lives, we do need a spiritual practice. We need something. We need something to say, I am marking the reality that I am different, that I have experienced, that I'm on the other side of this thing, and I'm making sure that I don't fall back into it in the same way. And that's just beautiful. I read this book years ago. It's called Rule of Life, Creating a Rule of Life, Crafting a Rule of Life. If you're the author, I don't know, chime in. But something Rule of Life. And it was about cultivating spiritual practices. And some language I learned at that time that was so special to me was having something that's descriptive and not prescriptive. And so I was invited to look at my life and figure out what practices already exist and ask if I can reimagine them toward a spiritual practice, right? So like, you know how on New Year's, everyone's like, I'm going to run 10 miles, I'm never going to have a carb again, and I'm going to like do all these things, and then 2 weeks later, you're like, what? Except for my man over here, he stuck to it. But we try to add all these things to our life, and it's hard to stick. This descriptive idea was like, what do I already do? Can I, while I'm brushing my teeth, while I'm taking a shower, while I'm in the car, are there things that already exist in my life that I can reimagine towards a spiritual practice? Things like the book of Deuteronomy, when we take it seriously and not literal, it's not about following all of those exact rules. It's saying, oh my gosh, that community understand what I'm trying to do in my life now is how do I create a new way of living now that I'm different, that I have found myself on the other side of something, and I should be different. All of the things still exist. Nothing changed just geographically, environmentally after the resurrection. Jesus changed. And so now that we find ourselves on the other side of something, whatever it is for you, how do we now engage in the world in a different way? And it's not about shame, or it's not about like making God happy and making sure you spend enough time that you do all these things, or there's some kind of magical equation. It's just about honoring the healing you've experienced. I know for some of us, for a lot of us, we have places where we've experienced healing and freedom, and then we have places where we're still wanting it. And we find ourselves somewhere in the middle. I think along the way, it's just important to recognize, oh, these things are still these practices, this level of maturity of a spiritual life requires me to protect this healing because it's precious. And I don't want to fall back in that pattern. And I don't want to just become the very thing that I left. And I don't want to be like the people who hurt me. And I don't want to be in this kind of thing again. And so that's what we're going to do. Great. Yes? Yeah. Oh, great. Okay. Then you're going to find 3 or 4 people around you and answer this question. What's one thing you can do to protect your healing this week? Enjoy.